that be me? Let's see what we get when we shuffle. Hello. Oh yeah. It's a really low quality version of Up Down Go. Let's see what else we get. Let's do a little bit of Flanders and Swan.
The first law of thermodynamics. Heat is work and work is heat. Heat is work and work is heat.
Hello, Jacqueline.
The second law of thermodynamics. Heat cannot of itself pass from one body to a hotter body. Heat cannot of itself pass from one body to a hotter body. Heat won't pass from the cooler to a hotter. Won't pass from the cooler to a
I'll be right back. Well, Jacqueline, maybe it'll just be you and me for now. Well, we'll get started. Entropy. All right. So, they have just encountered, so Pernicia's come and laid the spell. Rosie has woken up and Gnarl has come there, and Gnarl apparently is a fairy smith, which is of legend, although apparently he's not a very good fairy. They've had some of the animals wake up and join them, and now they are off to battle Pernicia or some such thing. Tara should be here. Oh, Pernicia. Lost track. Yeah, that's alright. He'll only miss like a minute or two. We can always catch up to the first bit online. Alright then. So they just leapt into the sky, or a thing that doesn't look quite like the sky, towards Pernicia's castle. Chapter 21. Well done. Perfect timing, Tyrell. We are just about to start. Chapter 21. They were flying like birds. The great thrust of the horse's hindquarters was long since spent, but something drew them on, faster and faster, as if they were sliding down a slope, except they were far from the ground, and going up and up, higher and higher, and the air was thin and icy cold. But were they going up? There was something wrong with Rosie's sense of direction, and the world or the sky or both were spinning round her. She closed her eyes, but that was worse, so she opened them again, opened them to see the purple-stained castle clearly in front of them. They seemed to be hurtling toward it. "No," she said, or gasped. "This isn't right. Too soon, not now." And she threw herself off Fast's back, Sunflower leaping clear, and hit the ground, some ground, with a bone-jarring smack, not daring to roll on account of the little creatures in one pocket and the hard knob of the spindle end in another. The wind was knocked out of her, and she lay dazed for a moment, unable to get up. Everyone else struck the earth just beyond her. Fast lost his own balance and fell. Gorse staggered and lurched and remained upright, while Gnarl half slithered and was half thrown off his back, Zell also leaping clear. Most of the hounds did somersaults. Rosie didn't see Flinks land, and only saw him a minute or so later, nonchalantly walking toward the rest of them. But he was wearing several small, heavy-looking twigs behind one ear, and a long dust smudge down one flank. Zell was the only one who seemed never to have lost his poise. Sunflower had none to lose. She sat down next to the half-stunned Rosie and licked her face. Throstle and the two mice crept out of Rosie's pocket and lay panting, as she was still trying to pummel the air back into her own abused lungs. Flinks sat down and began to wash. Rosie shook her head and levered herself upright. Fast was walking toward her a little stiffly. "Anyone hurt?" she said. Fast tossed his head. "No," said Gorse, "only a little rubbed backward." Let's see. That's important. Ice cream conversations are important conversations. I understand. I think I'll have ice cream after this. They were standing at a kind of boundary between a scraggy sort of wood behind them and an almost barren landscape with a little low scrub before them. There were standing stones scattered about, strange, unwelcoming shapes at strange, menacing angles. The castle itself rose from the scrubland like the biggest standing stone of all. It was twilight, but of dawn or sunset or something else they could not tell. The low lavender-grey clouds hid the motion of the sun here, too. It was a heavy, drab sort of light that did not feel like any sort of daylight any of them were accustomed to. Worse than the glary grey light of the briar-shrouded woodwold, and instinctively they drew closer together. Rosie looked first at the wood behind them, wondering if it had any relation to the briar hedge round woodwold. These were trees, not rose stems, even if they were no sort of tree she knew, and she thought they were not friendly. They seemed a kind of vegetable version of the heavy, unnatural light. She could sense nothing beyond them, neither building nor hill. She looked at the darkness among the trees, and was sure it was not unoccupied, and that they were being watched, although she could see nothing. And the only rustles she could hear could be explained by the roaming breeze around them. Gnarl said softly, "This place is sticky with magic. I can almost feel it on my skin, like blown sand, and it coats your tongue when you open your mouth. I think no foggy-bottomed housekeeper's charm could shift it. It's why neither the light nor the ground, nor those trees, look or feel right. You know you're being watched from the wood." Rosie nodded. They stood huddled together a little longer. Rosie turned away from her contemplation of the low, ominous wood and stared at the tall, malevolent castle. When she looked over her shoulder, she saw the first eyes blinking at her from the shadows. They, too, were violet grey. She did not attempt to speak to their owner. "Come on, then," she said in a voice she was pleased to find steady. "We have an appointment elsewhere." She stepped forward, Gnarl beside her, and the animals followed. She had taken 3 or 4 steps when she knew she had crossed some boundary. As her leading foot took her weight, the foot tingled, and briefly the sky or the castle or whatever bit of mid-air Rosie had been looking at gave a great writhe and became Pernicia's face, and she was smiling. And then the smile was only a gaunt wisp of cloud, and Rosie's other foot moved itself forward and planted itself on the ground, and it tingled too, although Pernicia did not reappear. Rosie felt Throstle and the mice rearranging themselves as if the pocket had suddenly grown smaller. Gnarl said nothing, but as the animals crossed the boundary, the horses snorted and bobbed their heads. Flinks hissed, and there was a faint grunt from Gnarl a step or two later, as Zell landed on his shoulders, scrabbled briefly, and then bestowed himself round his neck like a collar, or a scarf. Sunflower made a little yip. The hounds were silent, but suddenly there was a dog hand under Rosie's hand again, and she was glad enough to bury her cold fingers in the longer fur on the back of Rock's neck. She thought the journey across the barren land could not have taken very long, for she seemed no hungrier at the end of it than she had been at the beginning, and now that she was no longer thirsty, she was beginning to count everything in terms of her hunger. Or perhaps she was now so hungry that she would not feel any hungrier. The light had not changed either, growing neither brighter nor darker. But she felt that the light in this place was an even worse indication of the passing of time than her stomach. It had nonetheless felt like a long journey, and the dread of the ending will often make a journey short. But here they were. There was a moat round the castle, but there was no water in it. Standing beside it, looking down, Rosie thought it was hard to see just what was in it. It seemed to be a long way down, and weren't those rocks of some kind? Something greyish, brownish, purplish, and lumpy. Something that cast some kind of shadow, but they were weirdly blurred somehow, and weren't they moving? I would not look into the moat anymore, said Gnarl in the same gentle voice he had used earlier, but Rosie jerked her eyes up as if he had shouted at her. They turned to walk round the moat in the castle, but the strange push-pull, unbalanced something just behind you that's always moved when you turn to look feeling was suddenly very much worse, and they were all tripping and stumbling, although the ground was not that rough, and jerking their heads round to look at things that weren't there. The horses blew repeatedly through their nostrils, raspy, rolling, "I don't like this," snorts, and the dogs made little grunting noises that were neither barks nor growls. Sunflower and Tash, the youngest of the hounds, forgot themselves so much as to whine, but everyone else pretended not to notice. Flinks rematerialized from the outskirts of the company and began winding himself round Rosie's ankles. His fur was full of sparks, and they bit painfully through Rosie's trousers, which then clung to her legs and chafed. "What do you want?" Rosie said, too tired and hungry and worried and impatient to bother remembering that this is a bad question to ask anyone, and worse yet, to ask a cat. Flink stopped dead, so that Rosie nearly tripped over him, and Croc gave a little woof of annoyance. Flinks ignored the dog, but gave Rosie a resentful look. Rosie pressed the heel of her hand to the bridge of her nose, as if trying to push undesirable thoughts further in. "I'm sorry," she said to Flinks. "I've never been any good at random," she said. "The sky is very violet today, isn't it?" Her impression was that Flinks was more amused than mollified, but he stopped rubbing against her legs and trotted beside her for a time. Rosie could feel him thinking, but he was silent for long enough that she had the opportunity to notice that he was the only one of all of them who was not blundering over his own feet. She felt him notice her noticing. There was a certain sense of "at last" about it, and then he said, "The things that aren't there are not there in different ways. Some of them are almost there, and some of them are nearly not there." She could feel that Flinks was making a supreme effort to communicate plainly, but she could think of nothing to say in return but, "Thank you." "I think," said Gnarl, "that something is changing." Rosie could feel something pushing against her left side, something lumpy, as if a bag full of rocks were being driven into her. But there was nothing there, though she had to lean forcibly against it to avoid being shoved into Gorse. Gorse himself was walking diagonally, as if something were pushing at his left hip, and Frou was bent in a half circle, as if a very narrow something were bearing against the midpoint of her right side. None of them, except Flinks, was walking normally. At Gnarl's words, they came to a ragged halt. Flinks sat down and began unconcernedly to fluff up his tail. "Flinks says that the things that aren't here in different ways," she said. Gnarl said slowly, "Yes, this seems to be a neither here nor there sort of place, and the things here are neither here nor there either. Only they don't seem to upset Flink's sense of balance," said Rosie. "Perhaps cats are neither here nor there all the time," said Gnarl, and Flinks, picking up the gist of this through Rosie, gave Gnarl a thoughtful look before returning to his tail. But he paused again mid-fluff to stare searchingly at a particular portion of blank air. Rosie nervously looked where he was looking, and more or less reluctantly, so too did everyone else. Rosie couldn't decide if it was more as if an invisible door opened and let them out, or whether they merely formed themselves out of nothing. Whatever they were, they made you sick to look at them. Not sick because of their horribleness, but sick like a person who doesn't like heights looking down a very long way. Looking at them made you dizzy and gave you a headache, and you suddenly felt you no longer knew which way was up and which down, and you wanted something to hold on to, except that there wasn't anything to hold on to except each other, and that wasn't any good because all the rest of you felt exactly the same, except Flinks. Rosie dragged her blurred, aching eyes away from them, whatever they were, and looked at Flinks. Flinks was still sitting, but sitting to attention, watching the things come, if come was quite the right word, closer. For closer they undoubtedly were, and when they came right up to them, Flinks said suddenly, "Tell that foot hammerer to mind his other makings. He says he bends air as he bends iron. Let him do it now." And then he leapt to his feet, and all his hair stood on end, so he was a super Flinks, large as a wildcat, and he screamed, the several octave range of a cat, about to plunge into a cat fight, and then he shot off, toward the upside-down making things that approached him. He says he bends air. What? There were often cats at the forge, Rosie remembered, perched here and there, staring at nothing. But cats stare at nothing wherever they are. That's something a seer can do, give other people visions as... That's something a seer can do, give other people visions as false as their own. "Gnarl," said Rosie with difficulty, can you make lots of Flinkses?" Gnarl stared at her. She could see by the tension in him that he was feeling the same strain she was, but she was not as strong as he. And while he clasped his hands together till his arms strained at his sleeves, her right arm was being dragged upward into the vacant air, while her left hand was trying to crawl up her spine. "Back in the hall," she said. "You said about seers." Understanding leapt into Gnarl's eyes, and he glanced towards the approaching things, and at Flinks, still yelling and streaking back and forth under the bits of them that seemed to touch the ground, which should have been feet but weren't. The bits above what should have been feet extended a great way up and sideways, and Rosie, following his look, had a brief, wild impression that they were tripping over him, or maybe that they were turning to give chase, as if in the place they came from they were a sort of dog, and recognized even in this place, which must have seemed very queer to him, a thing like a cat meant to be chased. But there was only one of him, and no sane cat would attack a pack of dogs. These things were closing round him. And then there were a dozen Flinkses, 20, twice 20, all of them spitting and squalling, all of them with their hair standing on end, all of them shooting back and forth among the dizzying things, and the things were now making noises of their own, rather like wind keening under eaves, and the fact that the things now seemed to have a great many more sticking down bits, as if they'd grown a great many more legs, gave an impression rather like a dog's hackles rising in reverse. The by now several times 20 Flinkses stopped hurtling back and forth through the crowd of the things. Rosie wondered how all the false Flinkses managed not to run into each other, and thought perhaps they simply ran through one another, and took off in several times 20 directions, and the things all scattered and went after them. The landscape was empty again, and the little company all stood up straight and sighed and relaxed. The strange grapplings that had seized them were gone, and here was Flinks, looking pleased with himself, having returned from nowhere anyone saw him returning from, giving a last lick to a nicely smoothed down tail. They had come a little farther from the castle during the confrontation with the unbalancing things, and now they looked around to reorient themselves. The castle had somehow got behind them. As Rosie turned to find it again, she heard Sunflower whine, not a miserable whine this time, but a small, intrigued, considering whine. These things looked rather more human, upright, swinging what might be arms, walking with 2 legs, though what they walked on and from where was a little obscure, since they seemed to be walking out through the doorless wall of the castle and across the moat on a level with the ground, although there was nothing there for them to walk on. They stalked across the invisible bridge, and as they came to the rough, tussocky ground beyond it, they spread out, so that the ranks of them coming towards Rosie and her friend was 20 or 30 bodies wide, faceless bodies. They had head shapes at the top of their body shapes, but there was no glint of eyes, no irregular shadows from the hollows and protrusions of other features. Sunflower began to bark and leap, rushing back and forth in front of her companions, wagging her tail feverishly, sometimes curling herself up into a circle and spinning round and round in place, uttering little cries, half whimper, half yelp, which was all what she did any time there were visitors at Woodwall, and she was neither out hunting, when she was the model of a sober, dedicated retrieving dog, and never made a gesture or sound without the direction from her huntsman, nor locked up somewhere. She obeyed about half the Prendergasts. If any visitor were so unlucky as to meet her with only one of the other Prendergasts in attendance, they were on their own to face the barrage. "These are mine," she said to Rosie. "Tell the fairy." And she galloped off toward them. Rosie didn't have to tell Gnarl. There were 100 sunflowers before she'd gone more than a few bounds, 200 before she arrived at the marching first row of things. The sunflowers leapt on things, striking them in what might have been their groins and their stomachs. The ones she knocked down immediately, she began to lick furiously, especially around the face regions, and convincing-looking arms rose up to try and fend her off. But she was an old hand at this game, and she knew how not to be fended. Those things that had not immediately been knocked down, she circled round behind and flung herself at the backs of knees, smalls of backs. More of them fell down, and she began to lick them too. They didn't like being licked. They thrashed and wriggled and made snatches at the sunflowers, which were never where they had been when the snatches began, and tripped up those few of their fellows that some sunflower or other hadn't already managed to hurl down. There were by now more sunflowers than there were things, and the sunflowers not occupied in licking amused themselves instead by running across the supine, or occasionally prone, in which case the attending sunflowers rootled relentlessly about the head to get at where the face should be, bodies of the things, landing heavily and taking off again, with a great deal of thwacking and scrabbling. The things seemed to be growing thinner, as if the false sunflowers were licking the magic away, and that magic was all there was of them. Quite suddenly, the sunflowers standing on the bodies of their victims started thumping abruptly to the ground as the things disappeared. The false sunflowers began to disappear too. There were 6 left when the last thing flicked out of existence, and then there was only one sunflower. She looked round to check that her duty was done. For a moment, Rosie could see the faithful, thorough hunting dog in her expression, and she came trotting back toward Rosie, grinning hugely, with her tongue lolling out of her mouth. What unusual battle scenes. She permitted herself to be patted and praised, leaning against Rosie's and then Gnarl's knees. The big hounds all looked deeply embarrassed. They had spent their lives looking the other way from Sunflower's excesses, unable to understand how she could be the same dog they knew out in the field, attending to business. She looked round at them with a glint in her eye, knowing full well what they were thinking. Then she sighed, stood up and shook herself, and looked over at Flinks, who was looking at her. Flinks stood up and wandered, as if carelessly, and thinking of something else, in the general direction of Sunflower, who stood still, watching, her tail a little raised. He paused and looked around, as if suddenly aware that he was, by some strange chance, very near to Sunflower, and then he walked the last few steps toward her and raised his face. She lowered hers, and they touched noses. "Not bad," said Flinks. "Not bad at all." Sunflower's tail gave a slow, majestic wag. "Well," said Rosie, and patted Gnarl's shoulder as she had just been patting Sunflower's. "Are you all right?" Thank you." Gnarl shook his head, and his other hand reached for Rosie's patting hand and held it. "Rosie," he began, and stopped. "Rosie, whatever happens," and stopped again. He smiled at her, a funny, half-sad smile. Iron Face, smiling. Rosie heard the animals murmuring round her, "The block, cracking," from Flinks, and said, "I'm too tired and stupid to put it into words, and if I weren't so tired and stupid I wouldn't be trying. Don't thank me. It's an honor to serve you, Princess." Don't call me princess, shouted Rosie, snatching her hand away, feeling as if he'd struck her across the face. I'm sorry, he said wearily, but we'd better get used to it, hadn't we? He turned away and began to walk slowly back toward the castle. After a moment she followed him, and the animals closed up round them, and soon they were walking side by side, but neither of them spoke. When they arrived at the edge of the moat again, they found their own footprints in a patch of rough sand, setting out in the other direction. They had come all the way round, and except for the knot door and knot bridge that Sunflower's things had used, they had seen nothing resembling a way in. Somewhere, Rosie thought, Pernicia is waiting. Is she watching us? Has she known of us since the moment Esqua opened the rose hedge? Is she scornful? Is she worried? Are we not what she expected? Is Peony still alive? Rosie's mind bucked away from that last thought, and instead she said to herself crossly, but Pernicia should want to see us. And Rosie wrapped that thought round with an irrational irritation similar to what she would have felt if she had turned up to someone's farm to look at a horse and found no horse and no one home. She should want to see us. She should want to finish what she started. Rosie's irritation drained away, and she was standing in the middle of nowhere with a few friends round her, and the little wind that blew past her smelled of dust and emptiness. How do you build a bridge out of nothing and unlock a door that you can't find? All that was round them was dirt and sand and stones, and the things at the bottom of the moat that weren't stones. She took the gargoyle spindle end out of her pocket and looked at it. She was thinking about the 20th fairy gift at her name day, the one just before Pernicia had come, the one that had given Pernicia the shape of her curse. Catriona had told her about that too, the last day in Foggy Bottom. You could spin thread till you had enough to make a rope. You could make a bridge out of rope. If only I had something to spin with, she said, and ran her other hand through her hair in a characteristic gesture of discontent or dismay. Much too short, said Narl. Try mine. He plucked a hair from his head and held it out to her. Rosie hesitated. She remembered what had happened with Peony's bit of cloth and embroidery silk. But to spin something they might all walk on, even from a fairy gift, especially since she didn't know how to spin. She only knew what it looked like from watching Cat and Aunt. She held the spindle in one hand as if telling herself, or Narl's single black hair, or the magic sticky air, what she wanted, and then she gave the hair a twist as if it were fluff from a sheep she wished to mould into thread, and she closed her eyes. Immediately she felt something, coiling and looping and winding through her fingers, and she felt the spindle end spinning and spinning and spinning till her fingers were hot with friction, and heavy curls of something were falling down her arm and piling up at her feet, and at last she felt the spindle being snatched out of her hand, and Narl's voice almost laughing in her ear. Enough, enough. Imagine if I'd given you 2 hairs. Cautiously she opened her eyes. Around them in great silky waves lay the something. Black it was, as black and glossy as Narl's hair, and it shimmered in the sullen light as if it were breathing. She picked up the end of it that still lay at her feet, and discovered a kind of supple rope, as big around as her 2 hands could grasp, but as light and flexible as Narl's single hair had been. Can we make this into a bridge? She said. I have a better idea, said Narl. I don't see a door, do you? And I bet the roofs know better. Let's squeeze her out. She'll know where the doors are in her own house. He handed her the emptied spindle in, and she automatically gave its nose a rub before she put it back in her pocket. Squeeze? Said Rosie. But Narl was already paying out arm's lengths of the black rope, letting it coil up at his feet, and then kneeling, and measuring it a second time, squinting up at the castle as he did so, muttering under his breath, Not as if the best eye in the world is going to give us much help here. She felt tired. No, she felt exhausted and dull, and could not imagine what he had in mind. And then he stood up, holding the rope in both hands and the length he had measured between, and flung it. It seemed to blow up and away from them, like a single hair on a current of air so gentle you cannot feel it against your face. It spiraled for a while, and then it floated and drifted. And then it seemed to stop, seesawing, like a hare in a weakening draught, and Gnarl put his hands round his mouth and blew. The high centre of it shot up, as if awakened from sleep, dragging its languorous loops behind it, and at the peak of the castle it drooped a little, hung, and then fell, over the roof of the castle, one end caught by the crenellations, the other sagging toward the moat. But Gnarl was already running round the edge of the moat, shaking out the black rope behind him, and just before he disappeared round the far side of the castle, he took another handful of rope and gave it a yank and a flick, and Rosie saw the caught bit fly up in the air again and come softly down on the far side of the castle. Gnarl hastily tied the loose end round his waist, and was pulling the other in as quickly as he could, backing toward Rosie as he did so. "I don't think we want this to touch the bottom of the moat," he said, and handed her the long end while he untied the other. "Pull," he said. Rosie, bemused, pulled. What could rope made of nothing and one human hair do against the walls of a castle? She pulled. The rope seemed to clasp at her hands, as if it were a sentient member of the party, consciously trying to apply its own strength. She almost heard it trying to speak to her. If a house can speak, she thought wildly, why not a rope made of nothing? She took a better grip, scraped her boots in the ground a little, dug her heels in, and pulled. There was now an odd sort of smoke or fog rising off the castle, or dripping down its sides, and a strange vertiginous gleam where the rope touched its walls. A quaking, precarious gleam that made no sense if you looked at it. Made no sense in the same way the castle hanging in the sky over the briar hedge round Woodwold made no sense. Made no sense and made your head spin and your balance waver. The way the upside-down things that had chased the flinxes made no sense. The way the things in the bottom of the moat. Don't look in the bottom of the moat, Rosie told herself. Don't look at the contact point between a rope that doesn't exist and a castle with no doors. Just pull. Pull. She glanced over at Gnarl. His face was drawn into deep lines with the intensity of what he was doing. And she felt a tiny, foolish stirring in her breast, a stirring of hope. If he thinks. She realized she was nearly tipping over backward. The rope was lengthening, or the castle wall was yielding to pressure. Sure it was. Easy as squeezing whey from a stone, like the brave tailor in the story. In the story it was cheese, and he only said it was stone. Don't look, don't think, just pull. She read, sure it was. Sarcasm. Don't look, don't think, just pull. She resolutely looked away from the castle and the moat, backed up a step, 2 steps, to keep the rope taut. The smoke, or whatever it was growing thicker, and it was enough like ordinary smoke that it made her eyes water. It caught in her throat and made her cough. Pull! She looked to her left. She could still see Gnarl through the increasing murk, but the animals beyond him were little more than huddled shapes. You loathsome child! Spat into her mind. She flinched and might have slackened the rope, but the rope itself reached out and wrapped itself round her hands. She stood, wondering if she would trapped, seeing out of the corner of her eye Gnarl taking another step backward as he kept attention on his end of the rope, feeling the pull on her own wrists, staring at her helpless hands, feeling the weight of the spindle end hanging in its pocket, tapping against her thigh. Rope? She said tentatively. The rope did not reply, but she no longer felt trapped, but embraced. Look at me! Rosie jerked, startled, grasping at the rope with her fingertips, looked up. Pernicia stood there, carrying something in her arms. Someone. Peony. You cannot have her, Rosie said without thinking to whom or how she was speaking. You cannot have her. Peony lay lightly in Pernicia's arms, as if she weighed no more than a hollow doll. Perhaps Pernicia was very strong. Perhaps the uncanny air of this place bore Peony up. Perhaps the magic of the poisoned sleep also robbed her flesh of its living weight. That it was Peony herself and no false semblance, Rosie was sure. She did not believe that even Pernicia could make so fine a replica of her friend that Rosie would not see through it at once. There was the faintest of frowns on Peony's face, as if she knew, somewhere in the back of her sleeping mind, that something was not quite right. You cannot have her. It's me you want. I want neither of you, but I will have both. No, not Peony. It is not her fault. Her fault? Her fault? It is not her fault that she agreed to this shoddy, despicable charade. It is not her fault that she seized my spindle's end. But I do not care whether it is her fault or not, any more than I care that a stupid, hulking girl was first born to the king and queen 21 years ago, rather than 201. I have been waiting my time, and it has come. Her words rang, or bellowed, or crackled, or reverberated strangely in Rosie's head, or her ears. Rosie had never been quite sure how she spoke to animals, nor how they spoke to her, other than that something happened besides the ordinary sounds and gestures most people heard and saw animals make. And each animal had an idiom, a vernacular, a little different from every other animal. For some animals, like dogs, elaborate their speech with sneezes and barks and growls and tail waggings and ear flattenings and yawnings and pawings and bowings and many other sounds and gestures, while some animals, like most insects, had a speech that was little more than a series of clicks and ticks in a kind of code Rosie happened to have the key to, mostly. Pernicia's speech seemed to be all of this, as if dogs and cats and cows and horses and hawks and beetles were all speaking the same things simultaneously, except that they would not use the same signals, the same expressions, and although Pernicia stood silent and motionless with Peony in her arms, with the rough discordance that should not have been comprehensible but was, there was something else, and the something else was in the grey and purple fog that slid and swirled round the castle. Rosie swayed a little, and the rope, drawn close round her wrists and forearms, held her up. Yes, I am speaking to you in that brute speech you favor. It suits you, said Pernicia. It suits you so much better than any human tongue. It suits what you have become, country maid, simpleton, beast girl, who you are, because is not what you have become what you are best suited for? Have you not spent many hours wondering why you are as you are, why it fits you so well these last 3 months, and why the last 3 months did not? For that alone it was worth waiting till your final birthday, thinking of you, wondering. It took me but a moment when I realized the truth, why you had remained hidden from me for so long, when I looked for you so eagerly. I had been looking for a princess. Rosie shook her head numbly. It was true what Pernicia said, that Rosie was not a princess, but she knew this already. She knew that Pernicia said it to hurt her, but it did not hurt her, and she wondered if the only reason Pernicia chose to speak to her this way, in this clumsy, cacophonic beast speech, was to humiliate her. Pernicia would not have thought to ask the animals where to find the princess, and they would not have told her had she asked. And as she had not thought to ask them, she had neither thought to punish them for their refusal. Rosie's words did not hurt Rosie. Pernicia's words did not hurt Rosie, but fear of what she might do, was planning to do to Peony, hurt her very much. She could no longer see Gnarl, nor the animals, nor the castle. She was alone in the purple-grey murk with Pernicia, and Peony's life lay between them. Come to me, said Pernicia, and her words yelped and roared and hissed and sang and clicked and tapped. Come to me. You want to save your friend? Then come and try. You will not succeed, but I have had more bother over you than you are worth, and perhaps watching you fail will be some recompense for my trouble. She bent swiftly, with little eddies of fog scuttling out of her way as she moved, and the long folds of the black and purple and cerise robe she wore rearranged themselves, and Rosie noticed there were long rents in them, as if perhaps they had been caught and torn by thorns. She laid Peony at her feet. Peony sprawled, limp as a child's toy or a sleeping baby. Her hair was coming free of the crown of inheritance the king had placed on her head, and tumbling round her, and the superabundance of her princess ball-gown skirts made her look tiny among them. They seemed to froth over the edge of something into nothing, although Rosie could neither see the something nor the nothing, wrapped as both were in the muddy haze. She remembered that she had only been a few steps from the lip of the moat when Pernicia had appeared, standing apparently on the naked air over the moat, emerging from the unbroken wall of the castle. Was the moat still there? Was the castle still there? But then none of this landscape existed as landscape should. They had all come here from leaping into the sky. But if Pernicia had dissolved all of it into this thick, grimy fog, what was she, Rosie, standing on? And if the castle was no longer there, what was the rope that still held her pulling against? Rosie shook her head. The fog in her mouth tasted foul. She tried to free herself from the rope, but it would not let her go. You don't exist, she thought. Go away. I have to try to reach Peony. But it would not let go. She stepped forward, and it writhed beneath her stepping foot. A loop felt its way round her, like an arm round her shoulders. She could feel it round her ankles, leaving her just enough space to take small steps. It was strangely squashy to walk on, like a bog before you began to sink, and she remembered the old bog charm Aunt had wound round her long ago, and how much she had resented it. That had been before she was a princess, when she had understood her world and been happy in it. The rope still grasped her hands, but now it seemed to lead her on, as Rosie might have led a skittish horse. It led her steadily, gravely, confidently. She took another step forward, and another. If the moat was still there, she was now over it. But walking was more difficult now, and her feet seemed to grope from one swaying, spongy, irregularly placed loop of rope to the next, sliding anxiously along, fearing that the in-between would not hold her securely enough, that her foot would slip over the edge into nowhere. She was panting for breath, and now she gripped the rope as strongly as it gripped her, leaning against it, feeling for its narrow, yielding roundness against her feet, pressing its coils against her sides. But she was still sinking, or perhaps she had not climbed high enough. When she neared Pernicia and Peony, her face was nearly level with Peony's, as she lay at Pernicia's feet. Rosie reached out with her rope-tangled hands to touch Peony's face, and heard Pernicia shout an "Ah!" that made whatever Rosie was standing on vibrate like a young tree in a strong wind, and then she stooped. Pernicia's stooping seemed to take a very long time, as if she were a merrow plummeting down upon its prey from half a league overhead, and Rosie watched those long-fingered hands reaching to seize her, as she scrabbled Peony toward her. Peony slid as if she was still lying on the polished wooden floor of Woodwald's great hall, and together Rosie and Peony fell backward into the pliant rope, with Peony half on Rosie's lap and half in her still pinioned arm. With some part of her mind, Rosie registered that Pernicia's hands were covered with scratches, as if she had recently had to fight her way out of a briar. But she felt one of those hands brush her shoulder, and she cried out, for that fleeting touch felt like the slash of a knife, and she glanced toward it, expecting to see blood soaking through her sleeve. And then there was a rustle and a rush, and a whispery, tickly blur, and Pernicia screamed, a hoarse, horrible scream, in rage and surprise, and threw herself backward, and there was a small terrier clamped to the hand that had just touched Rosie, and 2 mice dangling from her cheek and chin. And then Rosie was falling, clutching Peony as best she could, falling against the soft rope, as soft against her face as if she lay against Gnarl's hair. And then she staggered, for the coils had given way to 2 human arms, and her feet had struck the ground. She twisted one ankle painfully, but the arms held her safe, her and Peony. Together they laid Peony gently on the ground, Rosie straightening up just in time, not to be knocked onto her friend's body by a horse's foreleg banging into her side. The fog had thinned, now racing by her in streaks and tatters on the capricious gusts of wind that also clawed through her hair, and made the little huddle of animals and people all lurch against each other. But she could see very little, only more racing fog. And now here was Gnarl, offering to throw her up onto the back of the horse, fast. "The castle's gone," Gnarl said, raising his voice to be heard over the low, evil howl of the wind. "Your rope pulled the top off, and this wind is taking the rest. I'm not sure what happens now, but it won't be friendly. She'll pull this wind to her soon, and you must get away from here. If anyone can save you, fast can," he said, but his words were almost blown away before she could hear them. He said something else about the animals holding away. "Go on." She wants both of us, shouted Rosie, leaning against Fast and grasping his mane against the increasing buffeting. The wind was full of voices now, yammering and bellowing and clattering. Were they all Pernicia's voice? Gnarl knelt and grasped her ankle and heaved, flinging her up Fast's side and down across his back with a jerk that hurt her hip joint. Can't you hear them on the wind? It's you they're after. She's after. She only took Peony as a hostage because she missed you. They'll follow you and leave us, and I can just about make them think we aren't here anyway. We all have to leave this place. It's breaking up around us. Stay on the human road. Remember. Now go, go. She had just enough time to wind both hands in Fast's mane. As she laid herself as best she could along his back, she felt the wild strength of him bound into his full speed within a few strides, the wind trying to peel her off his back like a knife pares an apple. All round them she heard the evil magic in Pernicia's thwarted fury rising and rising to a pitch that might yet shatter the world. Fast can save me? From what? For what? For a little while she was wholly absorbed in the experience of fast running. The power, the terrifying power of it, the surge of the hindquarters, the stretch of the stride, the bunching together in preparation for the next surge, all compacted into a single motion and translated into the torrent of his speed. She had seen him run many times, for after her successful interference on the subject of his manners, she had been invited to watch him train. And upon its being very obvious to the master of horse how pleased he was to see her, she was also invited as a kind of good luck charm to the occasional match race that some other owners of some other horses misguidedly begged Lord Prendergast for. There was a flat, clear stretch along the riverbank of about 1.5 leagues that was used as a race course, for Lord Pren would not send Fast away to race elsewhere. He said he had no doubts about Fast's speed, and Fast was so clearly faster than any other horse he had ever run against that no other owner dared cry foul. Rosie remembered standing beside Fast just before one of those contests. She wasn't bothering to try to talk to him. His mind was full of spinning, glittery bits of fragments of running, wanting to run, waiting to run, being nothing but running with a bay coat stretched over it, and looking up into his rider's face and seeing a curious expression of determination settle upon it as he picked up the reins, the look of a man who was about to jump over a precipice. She hadn't understood it at the time, but she understood it now. But someone, many someones, were running with them, even as Fast outstripped them. Dimly, she could see sleek bodies beside them, other horses, dogs, wolves, foxes, wildcats, deer. Fast ran past all of these. She caught glimpses of slower animals, cows and sheep, bears and badgers, and of smaller animals, otters and martens and rabbits and hedgehogs and cats, and there were tiny streaks of motion she thought were mice and voles and squirrels. Overhead she could just make out the shapes of birds flying among the rides of cloud, and darting shapes that might be bats. She thought they were all running and flying in the same direction, Fast driving among them like a ship through the sea, although she could be sure of very little, for the wind of Fast's speed whipped tears from her eyes. But as they ran, she realized that those that ran with them were in fact opening and holding a way for them, and that beyond the animals that were her friends were other creatures that were not her friends, who would stop her if they could. Rosie could see, now that she had guessed what to look for, the occasional wicked face, rough and square, or delicate and oval, tall or short, human or half-human, or goblin or imp, peering at her through the ranks of her friends, reaching out hands or claws, or thick twisting or biting magics, to grasp her as she ran by, but none of them could reach her. Stay on the human road, Gnarl had said. They were running through desert places, like their land round the castle, and then they ran through trees, sometimes widely scattered, sometimes in groves, but always there was a clear way for Fast to go, clear and nearly straight, and his hooves seemed barely to graze the ground before he hurtled forward in his next tremendous stride. Stay on the human road. She could not tell if they were on a road or not, only that the animals had chosen the way. The fog cleared slowly, and the light grew brighter, and the landscape grew slowly less flat. There was a piece of hill line, she could see through Fast's streaming mane that looked familiar, and then they shot past a curious little basin of valley that teased at her memory, till she remembered, and remembering, understood. They had passed the northern boundary of the gig from the wasteland where no one went. They were now running over the ground where King Harold had fought the fireworms. The valley they had just passed was called the Dragon's Bowl, caused by the fireworms melting the landscape in rage when they could not defeat the king. She had not been here since she was small. Aunt used to collect Budeth near here, although in recent years she had stopped using it. The Dragon's Bowl is too far to walk on these old bones, she said, when Rosie had once asked her. It had been a senight's journey for the three of them, during the autumn expedition to collect all the wild things. Aunt and Catriona would spend the winter making up into charms or storing away for the next year. Fast was still running as swiftly as the footing would allow him, but she could feel his lungs beginning to labor, and his neck and shoulders were wet with sweat. She did not know how long they had been running, but she was tired from hanging on, smooth as a good horse's flat-out gallop was to sit over, and neither of them had had anything to eat in much too long. The way they were going was narrowing, too, and she could see more and more of those malign faces looking at her. Her friends were no longer running with them, but holding their line, struggling to hold their line, to hold pernicious creatures back. The first deviling that broke through, Fast dodged round, scarcely breaking stride. But the second one was bigger, and the third was not alone, but stood against her with 6 friends. Fast gathered himself together and leapt over them. Rosie shot up his neck when they landed, but she stayed on. Where are we? She thought. Fast. Even Fast cannot run the whole length of the gig. But then where are we going? Has pernicious host overrun the gig? What is happening in Foggy Bottom, at Woodwold? But Fast was running the length of the gig. They were on a road she knew, the road from Mistweir to Weybreak. The blood vessels stood out now on Fast's wet hide, and she could see the huge red hollows of his nostrils and hear the saw of his breathing. She tried to call to him, Fast, Fast, slow down, do not kill yourself. But he did not answer her, not even with a flick of his laid-back ears. She thought, he is right. If they catch me, it is all up for all of us. But what does he think I can do even if I get back to Woodwold, if Woodwold is where we're going? She took Peony because she knew if I lived I had to follow, but now, what is it I'm supposed to do? Ahead of them the line broke, and a scatter of deer, red and roe and fallow, scrambled dazedly across their path, and a mob spread out before them. Fast was now running past Moonshadow. Rosie could see fields and rooftops, but she saw no human beings, and no animals but the ones that lined her way. Fast faltered and then deliberately slowed, pulling himself together as if showing off for a mare, prancing, tail and crest high, toward the glowering creatures that blocked their way. Rosie half thought, half made herself believe that these creatures trod uneasily on the human road, that the roughness of their quick steps was not only due to their eagerness to seize her and pull Fast down. One of the enemy made a feint towards her and Fast, and a little group of deer and sheep blocked it. Rosie saw a bear rise up behind them, and another of the invaders was snatched and thrown over the head of his companions. Fast swerved to one side and back, leapt over some heaving tangle on the ground, and Rosie, struggling to maintain her seat, did not notice in time someone or something had her leg and was about to drag her to the ground. Fast sat back on his haunches and swung round, but the goblin swung too. Rosie beat ineffectually at its face, but it only sank its fingers more firmly into her flesh. If only she had some weapon. Where the cloth of her trouser leg was strained by the goblin's grasp, the gargoyle's spindle end drove painfully into her thigh. She worked her hand into her pocket and pulled it out, cracked it sharply across her attacker's face, and felt the goblin's hold loosen. Fast gave it an awkward punch with a hind foot, bending round and aiming as if he were planning to scratch his own shoulder, and it fell to the ground. Fast straightened out with a jerk that almost finished unseating Rosie and shot off again through the remains of the throng and pressed on. Rosie didn't quite have the strength to stuff the spindle end back into her pocket and tucked it into her waistcoat instead. Old friend that it was, she spared a thought for the sound of that crack and hoped it had been only the goblin's skull. Fast's hooves no longer grazed the earth with every stride, but struck it hard and jarringly. But he was still running, and they appeared to have outrun Pernicia's army, as well as their own friends. The little respite they had had outside Moonshadow had seemed to give him a second wind, and while he no longer ran lightly, he ran resolutely. Between her own and fast breathing and the wind in her ears, Rosie could hear nothing else. It was a very silent and empty landscape they were running through, thundering through the square at Treelight, and later across Smoke River's big common. Still, she saw no people nor any animals. They saw no one, not even a butterfly. And then there was the briar hedge, climbing up over Woodwold's outer wall, and spilling down the outside. They were thundering down upon it, on the main road from Smoke River, a wide and clear way, clear enough that Rosie could see the hedge from far away, see it grow ever closer and closer. They had not outrun all of Pernicia's army. Some of it was waiting for them. Those that had stood against them stood quietly, watchfully, expectantly. They had known that what they waited for had to come to them at last. They had no need to cry warning, not of one horse near foundering and one weaponless rider. They had no need to do anything. What they waited for raced towards them and would fall at their feet without their having to lift knife or stick or bare claw or fang. They stood with their backs against the briar hedge, many of them so knotted and twisted themselves that they were not immediately evident, especially to eyes as weary as Rosie's and Fast's. But as Rosie's eyes adjusted, she saw how many of them there were, several ranks of them standing out from the wall, silently, patiently, waiting. She could feel Fast's uncertainty and alarm, but she had no suggestions for him. He slowed nearly to a canter, looking right and left as she was looking. But while those that waited for them were most thickly grouped just in front of Woodwold's gates, half invisible among the rose stems, but marked by the road, where the road turned toward Foggy Bottom, the way was blocked by tall, armored creatures, clanking as they moved, as they turned their heads to look at her. Rosie could not see if they wore their armor like humans, or if it grew from their flesh. And then something hurtled past them, growling, and jumped at the faces of those standing in front of Woodwold's gates. Croc. And behind him, Milo and Tash and Frou, all of them red-eyed and streaked with foam from the speed and distance they had run following Fast's. Pernicious creatures gave way a little in surprise, and their stolid, irresistible, waiting strength was against them, because the hounds were quick and agile. Gaps appeared in the enemy line in front of the briar hedge, and Fast, who had come to a halt when the hound shot by, leapt forward again, and Rosie found herself shouting at the top of her lungs, shouting too with her inner voice, half aware of the armored creatures blocking the road to Foggy Bottom, rolling forward to close in behind her. "Woodwold! Woodwold, let us in!" And as a token, she pulled the gargoyle spindle end from her waistcoat and threw it into the heart of the hedge. And the hedge pulled itself back, like two ladies drawing back their skirts, the stems wrinkling themselves away and then hoiking themselves upwards, their tips rising higher yet above the walls, and then diving down again to wind their way among the thick bony mat of branches already there. But the gates remained shut, all 15 by 20 feet of them. Fast was running again, the last few strides he had left in him to run, surging into his speed again with his neck-cracking starting bounds. Rosie saw, out of the corner of her eye, a chain with some horrible spiked sphere on the end of it whistle harmlessly past his hindquarters as the end of the armoured line drew close to them. But if Narrow's gates did not open, she and Fast would merely shatter themselves against the bars. The gates were too high to jump, and the bars were too close together. Oh, we're almost out of time. We'll probably do a quick restart if we need to. So if we run out of time, we'll stop the stream, we'll start again, and we'll finish to a spot that is appropriate. All right. I'll read it again for another 20 seconds, and then we'll stop. Actually, no, let's stop there, tune right back in, and then we will carry on until we find a good spot to stop, all right? I'm going to end the stream here, tune right back in. We'll be back in 20 seconds. Hello again, friends. Sorry about the delay. I'm had some trouble saving that last. So I had to do some sort of screen capture to get it saved to my YouTube.